I'd like to welcome everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you very much for the organization. My name is Olivér Hortay. I am representing Századvég and the head of the Energy and Climate Policy Department. And I'm going to talk about a survey that we conducted in the autumn with a large sample covering entire Europe, and what sort of conclusions we can make from these surveys on the climate attitude of Europeans and the attitude to some of its major issues. There are four pillars of my presentation and key messages, and the findings I'll show. The first one is reinforcing the idea that we can also read in the literature that the climate attitude of Europeans is actually quite strong. Climate consciousness is high, climate skepticism is low, and people are worried about the impacts of climate change. The second key message is that as a result of COVID-19 had actually a positive impact on the climate attitude. This is a rather surprising result because since the crisis of 2008, we believe that secondary societal shocks normally tend to reduce the attitude of people. For example, right after the financial crisis in the US, the proportion of people who believed climate change is important was reduced by 10 percentage points. And this time, what we can see that as a result of COVID, actually the climate consciousness and attitude towards climate change has increased, especially in social groups where the climate skepticism is climate skepticism is normally high. And the next message is actually focusing on climate policy and the general approach of people to climate policy. And the main message within this context is that the community needs realistic climate objectives that do not lead to significant decline in living standards, and it is related to not specifically climate policies. And what we can see that also in this year we will continue our public discourse on how the EU should identify its own climate mitigation objectives. And I think people are relatively pragmatic about it. They believe that we should not really, we shouldn't be too ambitious in setting our objectives that would have a huge impact on their standard of living. And the fourth major message is related to the transitional cost and how these funds should be allocated. That was a huge debate on this very issue among the member states, especially when planning the next financial period and the RRP. So people believe that the polluter pays principle should be applied, and those member states that could contribute to the pollution at a larger extent, they should bear the cost as well. So let me just share some data with you. Since 2016, the Századvég Foundation has been conducting a public opinion poll survey covering all 28 European member states. So it's a large sample survey, and the main objective is every year is to identify the most important policy issues and ask the opinion of the general public on these policies and dilemmas. Data collection is based on 1,000 adults per member state randomly selected. And in 2020, which was the last data collection that took place in the autumn, so obviously we also raised questions in the context of COVID-19. Actually, I'd like to also mention that the results are publicly accessible on our homepage. So now the first question was related to climate skepticism. And there are two different types of it. One is basically the trend skepticism. So usually we refer to people with trend skepticism is that deny the existence of climate change, and and there is also another group who actually accept the fact that climate change is happening, but they do not accept the fact that it is man-made. We also had a question that is coming from the European Social Survey that was conducted in 2016, namely, in your view, is climate change caused by natural processes, human activity, or jointly by these two? And the trans skeptics are insignificant, so below 1%. So that means that there aren't many people in the European Union who would deny the fact of climate change. And the so-called contribution skepticism is also very low. In the very bottom low, what you can see, the data, actually, I would like to mention that the UK is also included in this one. So anyway, only 11% do not believe that it was man-made. Actually, there are two more things I'd like to also emphasize based on these results. The proportion of those who believe that it was exclusively a result of human activities represent a larger proportion. The EU average is about 11%, and those who are in either of the both extremes, so either only man-made or human-induced or only naturally induced, seem to be higher in the western part of Europe than in the newer member states. And I'd like to also mention that the proportion of climate skeptics is also somewhat lower in the V4 countries. Another important message, as I mentioned earlier, is the worry concerning the COVID-19 and the related climate change concern. We have done a regressive survey. You can see the results on the slide. On the left column, what you can see is the constant variables of the regression chart, and on the right is the coefficients of the climate-19 concerns. These are both positive, which means that in an analysis that we try to introduce lots of controls, so the impact of COVID-19 was a positive result, had a positive result in every country. That means that the climate concerns were impacted positively by COVID concerns, and the strongest was in France, in Germany, in Poland, and in Romania. So now I'd like to move on to the issue of climate policy objectives. So the third main message I'd like to make is focusing on selecting the right mitigation targets by the EU. As I mentioned, the European climate policy and the communication thereof are shaped by the mitigation targets. Of course, there are lots of people who've heard that at the end of 2019, the European Commission, with the new Commission, adopted carbon neutralism, a plan to 2050, and the previous 40% targets were increased to 55% in terms of carbon neutralism. And now the question is how these will be allocated to the various member states. When it comes to the target, there are two types of opinion if we disconsider the differences between member states. So one of the ideas or trends is to set really ambitious targets in order to make sure that the economic players and policy decision makers would be encouraged and motivated to make greater efforts in order to mitigate climate change. And the other group of people believe that we should take a more pragmatic approach, based on which we should maybe first look at the results of the emission reduction, and we should look at first whether or not our very ambitious targets are actually realistic, and we should set more realistic targets. So you can really see the results of our survey. So basically what the respondents would be agree with more within the EU. And what we can see that that at least half of the respondents agree with the more pragmatic approaches, which would not cause any huge losses in their quality of life. Especially in the newer member states, this actually proportion is much higher, accounts to almost 2/3 of the respondents. But what we can see that within the EU, there is also a large proportion of people who want to be more ambitious, 1/3 in old member states and 1/4 in new member states. So they believe that more drastic steps are necessary, even at the cost of paying themselves or sacrifice certain things themselves. And now going on to the fourth question, focusing on the allocation on the, let's say, cost of transition or mitigation. There are two major ideas, in some ways collusive ideas, and the idea is basically the two very different interpretation of solidarity. Basically, the idea is that there was a certain amount of emission of each member state in the past, and they are very different in each member state, and so is the steps they are taking. And the idea is that if we just look at all of the member states, what we can see is that there are some countries that will have huge need to have huge effort in implementing the transition. They have to transform their energy mix or economy in the coming 20 or 30 years, and therefore it would be worth channeling in funds from to these countries from the countries that maybe require less effort. And there is another trend where we believe that the majority of the larger polluter countries are so polluters at such extent because they did nothing in the past 30 years, and it would be unfair to punish those who have done a lot of effort in order to mitigate the emissions, and then they would need to finance the polluters. And one of the major principle of environmental protection is the polluter pays principle, and it would go against this because people would receive money based on their past efforts. So basically, we try to map this the opinion of these people of respondents on this issue, and it seems about 3/4 of respondents believe that the application of the polluter pays principle should remain, and that and actually this proportion is even higher in the V4 countries, well over 80%. And now, to conclude my presentation, I will try to draw some policy conclusions based on the data I've presented earlier. One is seems to be a very stable finding, not just based on our survey, namely that in the European Union there is a very strong social legitimacy of climate measures and interventions. People are aware of climate change, that it is happening. People are aware that it was induced by human activities, or at least the majority of thereof, and they are worried about the impact of climate change. The second finding or conclusion is that COVID-19 actually had a positive impact on this attitude. Environmental protection is an area where the interventions normally have long-term impacts. Therefore, policymakers are rather worried of the unexpected social shocks that would break the positive trends as a result of these measures. But it seems that it's not necessarily like that, because in the case of COVID-19, it seems that it actually, in fact, had a positive impact. So this social legitimacy remained in spite of COVID-19. And the climate policy consequences include, for example, the fact that Europeans expect realistic climate targets and goals from policymakers. So policy objectives that is encouraged by the European Parliament without impact analysis should not be accepted. That's their opinion. And the other very important finding is that the cost allocation between member states should be based on the principle of the polluter pays. And larger emission countries who had not reduced their emissions in the past years should bear the cost to a larger extent and should contribute to the climate protection cost at a larger in a larger way. Thank you very much for your attention.